Why are we facing chip shortages? There's so many reasons it's hard to know where to start, but the biggest problem is that semiconductor manufacturing has over 5 decades failed to come up with a stable economic model that can be relied upon for the long term. The industry has always been beset by boom and bust, but the costs of getting in on the boom used to be somewhat reasonable, but now they have got out of hand, and that happened very quickly. The first fab I worked at was built in 1991 to make DRAM. The build cost was about £100 million, and it turned out 150mm wafers. When they were looking at expanding it, the expansion was planned to cost around £800 million and run 200mm wafers. That expansion was planned in the late 90s, but never went ahead because of the late 90s economic crisis. But that is to say, the build cost of a fab increased eightfold in less than a decade. Yes, the productivity of the fab would be much greater, but £800 million is a hell of a lot to risk when a downturn might be just on the card. So multiple companies dropped out or seriously reduced their fab building. Where are we now? Well, TSMC are building a megafab in Arizona, and that's going to cost around $12 billion, so the rate of cost increase has slowed, but it's still incredible. And again, there might be a downturn coming, which could put the $12 billion at risk. All this means there are fewer and fewer companies investing in leading-edge fabs. Sure, there's plenty of companies still running older technology. A lot of companies have found there's really good money to be made making chips at larger geometries, typically on 83 wafers and often with second-hand equipment, and that lack of investment is biting us now. Another compounding problem is the industry completely failed to figure out who should pay for and benefit from changes in wafer size. The semiconductor equipment firms, Applied Materials, Lam, Novellus et al., all poured billions into 300mm equipment, only to find the fierce competition in the equipment space and the relative ease chip makes have with switching processes between different manufacturers' equipment left the equipment firms unable to increase prices on vastly more productive equipment. The switch to 300mm wafers around the turn of the century let chip makers make out like bandits. They got vastly more productive equipment for basically the same price of the old stuff and left the equipment companies carrying the cost of the R&D without any return to pay for it. This has left equipment companies pretty disinterested in developing 450mm equipment. Lest that happen again, this means we've lost one of the two engines that kept making chip manufacture cheaper, which offset the increasing costs of building a fab. We used to have Moore's law squeezing more transistors in the same space so you could get more chips from the same size wafer, and at the same time we had wafer sizes continually increasing, meaning there was a second driver to get more chips per wafer, and that's really starting to bite. We have 5 companies building leading-edge fabs. The half is Intel. They seem less certain of what they are doing at the moment, and the leading-edge fabs that are being built don't add capacity at the rate they used to. There's likely to be a number of years uncertainty in the industry because there's a massive shortage. Samsung, TSMC and possibly Global Foundries will be thinking about building new fabs to cash in, but building a fab is years in the planning, and the equipment doesn't come out of nowhere, and they'll be worried that the shortage could turn into a glut if they all throw up more fabs. The semiconductor industry is broken in so many ways at the moment. It'll take some time to shake out. Consumer buying increased, but it didn't simply increase, it changed. A big one was the whole working from home thing. When things started closing down in mid-March of 2020, I urged my wife to get herself a Chromebook, as her janky old hand-me-down PC was on its last legs. Sure enough, she started teaching classes virtually and was pretty happy to have that $200 Chromebook. Eventually joined them a laptop a week or two after she bought it. You might have been able to find a $400 Chromebook if you were lucky. In fact, and 2020, PC industry sales rose by better than 11% versus 2019, with a 14% boom in the USA. The top 10 semiconductor manufacturers saw a 17% increase in sales in just the first half of 2020, and that was after a decade of declining sales. Cinnawin was prepared for this. In fact, many PC industry manufacturers had their projections based on the year-over-year shrink of the industry, so they were going the wrong direction on chip allocations. Companies like AMD and Nvidia also had major new releases coming in the second half of the year, so they were shrinking stock on those older parts in anticipation. It wasn't just PCs, but gaming consoles that surged in 2020, kids stuck at home, adults with unspent travel money burning holes in their pockets. Sales of gaming consoles surged, despite the big three, the Sony PlayStation, the Microsoft Xbox, and the Nintendo Switch being ready for replacement within the next year or two. Game sales, online gaming hours, etc. also surged, and today's gaming consoles are competing for the same basic resources as PCs, mobile devices, and other things. And then there's cloud computing, ICs for data centers, including CPUs for web serving and GPUs for AI, have been rising steadily, but the pandemic moved vast parts of the world economy even more online in about a month, so the demand for increases to data centers grew well beyond predictions. And of course, data centers are all using CPUs and GPUs based on versions of the same technology used in home PCs, and even companies like Amazon and Google, who make some of their own cloud-specific ICs, they're vying for much the same production resources as everyone else. Another factor is new markets for silicon, like cryptomining. At the moment, gamers and cryptominers have been duking it out over supplies of the GeForce 30 GPU series from Nvidia, in fact to the extent that Nvidia is splitting cryptomining into another specialty part, like their professional and compute GPUs, and lowering crypto performance on mainstream GPUs in order to preserve their gaming market. The bump in performance of a new GPU series can be money in the bank for cryptominers. That's the obvious reason for the GPU storage specifically. But of course, if Nvidia could get more production with TSMC, they'd be more than happy to make enough GPUs for everyone. While some cryptomining takes place on dedicated cryptomining processors, those are made in the same fabs as everything else. Early on, car sales plummeted, and suppliers of automotive semiconductors switched over to consumer and computer electronics parts where possible. Car manufacturers cut their orders, but then, whoops, the automotive industry bounced back faster than expected, only with a major shortage of many needed chips. Part of it was the rise of the fabless semiconductor manufacturer. Traditional IC companies like Intel and Samsung have their own IC fabrication lines and can decide internally which parts make more sense for their market, but a huge sector of the industry, including AMD, Apple, Nvidia, Qualcomm, Broadcom, and others depend on contract IC fab companies like TSMC and Global Semiconductor. In 2020, 32.9% of all ICs were manufactured by a contract fab, and an even larger percentage of the leading-edge parts. When a semiconductor company contracts with a fab for IC production, they generally have to make their requests known well in advance. As IC fabs have become more expensive, their owners need to keep them as fully active as possible to maximize profit and ensure they're able to pay for the next set of process advances. In fact, this need to keep IC fabs full is what initially led to contract manufacturing and fabless semiconductor companies. Samsung, for example, has their own production lines, but fills in their own work with outside contracts to keep the lines going. Even Intel contracts out some chip fab capacity, so while a fabless company might be able to shift exactly what they're making on the same processes, they can't necessarily do anything short-term about their total capacity, since the contractor is fully booked. TSMC, the largest of the contract manufacturers, is fully booked through 3Q 2021 right now, and the more aggressive process lines, like 7nm and 5nm, were probably booked to capacity a few years back. TSMC's 3nm process isn't even online yet, and it's fully booked through 2024. In short, the tight market for state-of-the-art chip technology, forced both by the cost of new fabs and the use of contract fabs, has made the industry very inelastic when it comes to unplanned demand.